Most people, when they imagine being controlled, picture something they would feel: pressure, resistance, a moment where something inside them pushes back. But the most complete form of psychological influence leaves none of that. No pressure to resist, no moment to identify. The person being shaped doesn't experience it as influence at all. They experience it as their own thinking. That is the dark psychology of control that almost no one examines honestly, not because it's hidden in extreme situations, but because it operates inside the ordinary ones, the everyday conversations, the relationships that feel natural, the decisions that felt entirely like yours. This video will not tell you how to protect yourself. It will do something quieter than that, and more unsettling. It will show you that the influence you never noticed may already be the reason you think the way you do. There is a particular kind of conversation that ends with you feeling like you made a decision, and you did. That part is accurate. What's less accurate is the assumption that the decision was entirely yours to make. Consider the last time someone offered you a choice between two options. You weighed them. You deliberated, you selected one and moved forward feeling autonomous. But at some point, maybe immediately, maybe weeks later, a quieter question arrived. Who decided those were the only two options? Who constructed the frame before you ever stepped inside it? This is how covert influence actually operates, not through pressure, not through persuasion that announces itself, through the quiet architecture of what gets defined as possible before a single word of convincing is spoken. The dark psychology beneath this mechanism is precise. Decisions feel most free exactly when they have been most carefully pre-shaped. The person being influenced doesn't experience a reduced version of their own thinking. They experience their full thinking, operating inside a room that someone else built. Think of the emotional temperature of a room you walked into and immediately adjusted to. A gathering, a conversation, a dynamic that was already in motion before your arrival. You calibrated to it without registering the calibration. You became appropriate to the atmosphere. And the person who set that atmosphere before you arrived never said a word about it because they didn't need to. This is not a tactic reserved for manipulation experts or dark triad personalities. It is a human behavior pattern so common that its very commonness is what makes it nearly invisible. There is a particular moment this becomes uncomfortable to sit with. A man reflects on a significant decision, a professional direction he took, a relationship dynamic he accepted, a version of himself he became over time, and he cannot identify the moment it was imposed on him. Because it wasn't imposed, it was constructed around him, gradually, through ordinary conversations and repeated emotional environments, until the constructed thing and the chosen thing felt identical. They had become identical. The uncomfortable edge of this truth is not that people manipulate, it is that the most effective influence in a person's life rarely comes from people with bad intentions. It comes from people who simply know, consciously or not, how to set a frame and never once had to force anything. Two people having a calm conversation. One is speaking reasonably, generously even, offering what sounds like genuine perspective. The other is nodding, not out of weakness, not out of social pressure, but because the framing arrived before the argument did. By the time the words came, the architecture was already in place. Agreement didn't feel like agreement. It felt like recognition, his own thought, arrived at independently. Nothing coercive happened. Nothing could be named afterwards. And that is precisely what made it complete. The most dangerous form of psychological influence is not the kind that makes a man feel cornered. It is the kind that makes him feel most like himself, most clear, most decided, most free in the exact moment he is furthest from his own unmediated thinking. Not all cages have visible walls. Some feel, from the inside, exactly like open ground. There are emotions that arrive without a moment you can point to. Not grief, not anger. Those have origins. What this lesson concerns is quieter. The guilt that appears after a conversation where nothing unkind was said. The inadequacy that settles in after an interaction that felt, on the surface, entirely warm. You leave, you carry something, and when you try to find where you picked it up, the memory offers nothing. This is not a mystery of the mind, it is a mechanism. Emotional seeding, one of the more precise instruments in the architecture of covert influence, works not by delivering an emotion, but by creating the conditions under which a person delivers it to themselves. The influencer does not hand you guilt. They arrange the room so that guilt is the only thing that fits. A sentence that isn't quite a criticism, but isn't quite not one. A pause that lasts slightly longer than silence usually does. A question asked with a specific weight, the kind where only one answer feels socially survivable. Your own psychology does the rest. You fill the ambiguity with the interpretation that closes the loop, and you do it entirely on your own, which is precisely why it never feels like influence. It feels like realization. Think of someone you know, professionally or personally, with whom you consistently leave interactions carrying more than you arrived with. A vague sense of responsibility for something unnamed. A feeling that you may have missed something, fallen short of something, disappointed something. The other person appears to carry nothing. The asymmetry is visible, but it is never examined. It is quietly normalized. You begin to assume the weight is simply yours. This is the particular cruelty of the dynamic. It is almost impossible to name without sounding irrational. A man who says, "That conversation left me feeling guilty for something I didn't do," must then explain how. And the explanation, even to him, sounds like overthinking. Nothing was said, no accusation was made. The feeling simply appeared. To point at it is to appear to be pointing at air. The deniability is not incidental, it is the design. And here is the dimension of this that most conversations about dark psychology and manipulation awareness fail to reach. The person seeding the emotion is often not fully conscious they are doing it. They have learned over time, through iteration and feedback, that certain arrangements of words and silence produce useful results. The mechanism has become habit. They do not plan the pause. They do not calculate the implication. It simply happens, which makes the dynamic nearly impossible to confront because there is frequently no intent to point at, only effect. The man replaying the conversation afterwards finds nothing. The memory is warm, even pleasant. No sentence stands out, no moment shifts, and yet something remains, a residue. He searches for its source and finds only himself, and so he accepts it as his own. That acceptance is the final step of the mechanism. An emotion with no traceable origin is not always evidence that nothing was done to you. Sometimes it is evidence of how precisely it was done. But by the time you feel it, it already belongs to you. And that is the part that was never an accident. There is a particular kind of man who is difficult to deceive in the obvious ways.
He has read enough, studied enough. He recognizes the patterns, the flattery that arrives just before a request, the manufactured scarcity, the appeal to identity disguised as compliment. He notices things in rooms that other people miss. And this is real. This is not vanity. The awareness is genuine. But there is a layer of influence that this awareness does not reach, not because the man is unsophisticated, but because the influence is not operating where sophistication looks. The most effective covert influence does not move through tactics, it moves through relationship, through the slow accumulation of relational atmosphere, through identity, not what a person thinks in a moment, but who they believe they are across months of interaction. A man can intercept a manipulation tactic. He cannot easily intercept a gradual reordering of his own self-concept. Watch what happens in a long professional relationship or a close personal one. No single conversation is threatening. No individual dynamic raises a flag. He is watching, reading, appropriately skeptical, and because nothing he is watching for ever appears, he concludes, reasonably, that there is nothing to watch for. The influence is not in any conversation he could have flagged. It is in the accumulation of them, in what has already been deposited before he ever considered examining it. This is the psychology of identity-level influence, and it is the layer that dark psychology rarely names directly, because naming it requires admitting something uncomfortable. That the self-concept a man defends most confidently is also the one most available to be shaped. He trusts his perception of himself, and that trust is a door left slightly open. There is a paradox here that applies specifically to self-aware men. The more completely a person believes they cannot be influenced, the more precisely they can be. Because confidence in one's own read of a situation is itself a point of leverage. A man who fully trusts his conclusions is not skeptical of his conclusions, and his conclusions are exactly where sophisticated influence operates. He is not watching his conclusions, he is watching other people. The final pattern in this is perhaps the most unsettling. The most effective influence does not feel like resistance overcome. It does not feel like pressure. It does not feel like anything being done to you at all. It feels like growth, like clarity, like a man slowly becoming more of himself, more certain, more defined, more aligned with what he values, while quietly, incrementally, becoming what someone else needed him to be. And the person who created that climate never knew they were doing it. That last part is not a defense. It is the most important part of the mechanism. Unconscious influence operates precisely because it is deniable, to the person exercising it most of all. There is no guilt because there was no intention. There is no examination because there is no awareness of anything to examine. The influence simply happens, carried forward by unmet needs and habitual emotional responses, consistent as gravity, invisible as air. A person speaks warmly, genuinely, with no visible agenda, and the person they are speaking to quietly adjusts, softens a position, drops an opinion, reshapes a preference. Nothing coercive has happened. No line has been crossed, yet a shape has been applied to someone. Here is where the human behavior pattern becomes uncomfortable in a different direction. If this is ordinary, if this is not the province of dark personalities, but of ordinary people operating on unexamined needs, then the question is no longer only about who has shaped you. The question is who you have shaped. Not through calculation, not through cruelty, but through your own consistent emotional patterns, your own subtle withdrawals, your own unexamined preferences for the version of someone that required less from you. The brilliant person whose ambition you met with a particular kind of quiet concern, the friend whose confidence you found, without quite naming it, slightly too much. The person who softened over years in your company and whom you experienced simply as having matured. This is the mechanism the psychological manipulation conversation almost never reaches because it requires the examiner to become the examined. It requires the viewer who arrived looking for a pattern in others to sit with the possibility that he is not only the product of these dynamics, he is also one of their architects. Good intentions do not determine impact. A man who has never looked at his own patterns is not less influential than one who has. He is simply less aware of what he is leaving behind. The world outside this video has not changed. The same people are in it. The same conversations are waiting. The same versions of yourself you have always relied upon. The one who knows what he values. The one who trusts his own reading of a situation. The one who believes his conclusions arrived through his own thinking. That last one is the one worth sitting with. Dark psychology does not always enter a life dramatically. Most of the time, it enters the way water enters stone. Ordinary pressure, ordinary repetition across ordinary time. And what it shapes eventually are not just decisions, it shapes the interior voice that evaluates them. You will walk into your next conversation carrying something this video placed there. But here is the question that will not leave quietly. How many things were already there, placed by someone else, long before you thought to ask?